What is up, nerds? Welcome back. Are you having trouble deciding between the Sony A9 III and the brand new Alpha 1 II? You're not alone. Thankfully, I've got you covered. So last week, I flew out to Oahu for the Sony Open PGA tournament, and I spent the entire week using both of these two incredible cameras for everything from sports to wildlife, landscape. I even shot a little video, and I think I've finally decided, so much so that I actually bought two of them. If you stay to the end, I'll tell you which camera has earned a permanent place in my bag. Let's get into it. So in the last 12 months, Sony has announced two insanely capable flagship cameras that seem to be the perfect solution for wildlife and sports photographers. While the specs for these cameras have some very significant differences, their use case overlaps quite a bit, which causes a lot of photographers to get confused about which camera fits them better. To start, the Alpha 1 II is more than double the resolution with 50 megapixels compared to the 24 megapixels of the A9 III. But what the A9 III lacks in resolution, it more than makes up for in burst speed at 120 frames per second, quadruple the speed of the A1 II's 30 FPS. But of course, the real banner headline for the A9 III is the first ever full-frame global shutter image sensor. For those of you who aren't familiar, a standard sensor reads out the image line by line when you push the shutter. In the case of the A1 II, this happens very fast, 4 milliseconds to be exact, which is actually faster than basically every other camera on the market except for the A9 III. It's so fast that in 99.999 whatever percent of cases, you'll never notice. But in the instance of very fast-moving objects like, say, a golf club, or airplane propellers, etc., you can get distortion and warping, which is called rolling shutter. Contrast that with the A9 III's global shutter, where every single pixel on the sensor reads out simultaneously. It's a very niche feature, and the trade-off is slightly worse dynamic range and ISO performance, but if you need it, then you really need it. So let's talk about that rolling shutter. On this T-sequence here, you can see that the 4 millisecond readout speed of the A1 II sensor is fast enough that there's really no distortion. Zooming way in on the golf ball in this shot shows that it is maybe a little oval-shaped, but not enough to worry about. In fact, it could be the result of motion blur rather than rolling shutter. To test this, I increased my shutter speed to 1/10,000, and honestly, it still looks great to me. The shaft of the club has some bend, but if we compare it to a shot from this exact same tee with the A9 III, that appears to just be natural flex from hitting the ball and is not a result of sensor readout lag. The rolling shutter was most apparent in scenarios where the camera itself was moving in addition to the subject, and that's when I did see a couple egg-shaped golf balls. Contrasted with this shot from the A9 III where I moved the camera, and you can see that the global shutter really helped because this ball is still pretty much perfectly spherical. Now, obviously the main benefit to the A9 III, other than the global shutter, is its incredible burst speed, like truly outrageous speed. So fast, in fact, that the image sequences can be played like slow motion movies. Except instead of 4K 10-bit, we have 120 frames per second of full-blown 14-bit RAW photos at 6K resolution. The A1 II captures 30 frames per second at 8K resolution in stills, but if you want 120 frames per second, you need to record video, and then it's just 4K resolution and 10-bit depth versus 14-bit 6K. It might not seem like something that's super important, but for action sequences like golfers teeing off, I found that having 4 times more photos to choose from means I can really choose the exact moment I want for my final shot. These sequences from the A1 II are nice, and I ended up with shots that I really like, but I'm a little bit at the whim of the camera. I only have 1 or 2 final shots to choose from, and those are it. That's my options. You spray and pray that the timing worked out. With the A9 III, I am literally getting slow motion video where every single frame is the quality of a full frame still image, so I can scrub back and forth and choose the exact moment that looks best. However, this speed does come with a major downside: the buffer. Shooting 120 FPS means a lot of images And the A9 III buffer can hold just 1.6 seconds of images shooting at the highest burst speed, meaning that several times I ended up with 150 images of a player's backswing and then almost no images of the actual shot because the buffer had filled. This was my first time photographing golf, so this is absolutely operator error, and with some technique adjustments, this quickly became a non-issue. But for sports where the action sequences are longer, like say, every other sport on the planet, this could be a major limitation. It's also worth mentioning that the 1.6 second buffer is 10 gigabytes of data. It's worth mentioning because that means that if you have a 160 gigabyte CF Express card in your camera, like I did for this event, you will completely fill the entire card after just 25.6 seconds of shooting. 25.5 seconds. As a fun little treat, we found this adorable little cattle egret on the golf course, and unsurprisingly, the A1 II is an exceptional camera for wildlife photography. I'm especially tickled by the auto subject detect autofocus capabilities. Gone are the days of having to choose human or animal, and then having non-functional autofocus if a different subject wanders into view. I know this clip is a little chaotic, but look at how incredibly fast the camera is at grabbing focus, even with wild camera motion and tough lighting. Moving the camera from the bird to a person, it seamlessly adjusts focus and locks the autofocus point onto the subject's eye, even if the person is wearing sunglasses. Both of these cameras have the same autofocus system, so this isn't an advantage to either one, but it's worth pointing out, I think, for sure. Side note, yes, the spectators did laugh at a credentialed press photographer at a professional tournament crouching to take photos of a bird. I didn't choose to be this way. I just am. The autofocus was also good enough to snap to this bouncing golf ball without missing a single frame. Honestly, we're at the point now where missing photos because of missed focus is a thing of the past. If you're even halfway competent with your camera, you're going to nail focus with either one of these choices. What the A1 II lacks in burst speed, it does make up for with resolution and image quality. The 24 megapixels of the A9 III is fine, but 50 megapixels really does open the door creatively and allows for much more leeway with composition in the field because it's not always easy to predict motion ahead of time. This isn't really much of a concern with a sport like golf where the players more or less stand still, but for sports with a lot more player motion and action like football, or for wildlife photography, of course, the ability to compose your shots a little wide and then crop in later in post is hugely helpful for making sure you don't accidentally cut off part of your subject. While the video specs between the two cameras are more or less the same on paper, the A1 II features the most powerful in-body image stabilization ever in a Sony body, up to 8.5 stops. So to test this, I headed to Kualoa Ranch, one of the filming locations for Jurassic Park, all of the Jurassic World movies, the TV show Lost, and basically every single thing Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson has ever done. With Autumn driving our vehicle off-road, I tested the two cameras side by side. With the IBIS set to standard, they both look pretty good, about as expected. It turns the stabilization up to active and you can start to see the A1 shine, although even here I think the A9 III holds its own, but over a particularly bumpy section of the road I turned both cameras to maximum stabilization, which is called Steady Shot Dynamic Active in the menu system, and it's very clear that the A1 II is a significant step forward here. I will say that although this is incredibly stable compared to the road we're driving, the camera's goal seems to be no camera motion whatsoever, which means that when you exceed its stabilization capabilities, it sort of jerks the frame to the left or right to try and reframe the shot. I think with future firmware updates, they'll likely be able to smooth that out, but for now it looks a little artificial, in my opinion. For landscape photography, again, the A1 II has the upper hand as it has twice the resolution, but also better dynamic range. I shot a little bit in this wide open field, and unless you zoom in, the two images look more or less the exact same to me. I also shot directly into the sun to try and push the limits of dynamic range, and to be honest, both cameras handled it very well. I do think the A1 II image looks a bit sharper and cleaner, but I wouldn't be upset with either of these photographs. For shots like this, they're both equally competent cameras, but later that evening we went on a sunset catamaran cruise, and the base ISO of 100 on the A1 II versus the base ISO of 250 on the A9 III did end up being super helpful for the extremely dynamic, high contrast lighting. As the sun set and the scene got darker, again, I found that the A1 just produced cleaner images when shooting at a higher ISO, but again, this is me being extremely nitpicky. The images from the A9 III are still gorgeous, and honestly, I would have been completely happy if this was my only camera for the sunset boat ride. Also, a little bit of a silly side note, but I shot this entire review, all 3 days of shooting on just one battery for each camera. I don't have any definitive numbers to show exactly how long they last, but that was well over 2,500 photos for the A9 III and well over 1,000 for the A1 II, plus some little video clips, and both cameras still had about 20% battery remaining. I think that if I had to pick a winner here, I would go with the A1 II, but honestly, this was way closer than I expected. I've seen social media full of people commenting that the A9 III has bad dynamic range and the base ISO of 250 is limiting and the high ISO performance isn't good, and so I expected it to feel like a real compromise, trading speed for image quality. But what I found was honestly kind of the opposite. The image quality is gorgeous, and the blazing speed and global shutter are just icing on a very tasty cake. I think I do prefer the higher resolution of the A1 II, and it's just like a better camera overall for most photographers, since things like 120 FPS burst speeds are super specialized tools for very specific purposes. But if you are one of those niche photographers, the A9 III is a godsend of a tool. As an all-around camera for those of us who like to shoot a little bit of everything, the A1 II is genuinely the single best full-frame camera ever made, and I feel that so strongly that I have purchased 2 of them, and they will likely be the only cameras I use for the foreseeable future. If you are a professional sports photographer who specializes in Formula 1 racing or baseball or something equally fast, the A9 III is probably a perfect fit in your workflow, but for the rest of us, the A1 is just honestly as good as it gets. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this rundown, please hit like and subscribe, and consider donating $250,000 to your local animal shelter. Until next time, stay nerdy.